I'll say a few words based on the book and based on some of my recent experiences of involvement with various social movements in India, and then I'll be happy to participate in the discussion. The book that Kia mentioned is called An Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradictions. I noticed yesterday, I did a word search in the book, and I noticed that the word contradiction doesn't appear in the book at all. So we leave it to the readers to decide for themselves what they think of as the contradictions. But I think there are many things in India that one can think of either as contradictions or at least tensions and paradoxes. There's the paradox of a continuation of a caste system in modern society. There's the tension of huge economic and social inequalities. There's the contradiction between very rapid economic growth and very slow social progress in many fields, including health, education, and so on. There's an interesting paradox between, on the one hand, a country that has very vibrant media, freedom of expression, and perhaps a more extensive right to information than any other country in the world. And at the same time, in spite of that, all kinds of social problems are, if not hidden, at least out of view and outside mainstream discourse at least. And then there's one contradiction which I think is overarching in this whole story and was discussed with great clarity as far as back as 1950 by Dr. Ambedkar, who was one of the founders of the Indian Constitution, and who said just before the Constitution came into effect, this is a very well-known quote, but maybe some of you haven't heard it. He said, on the 26th of January 1950, which is when the Constitution was due to come into effect, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? If we continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in peril. Now, this, of course, is a contradiction that is not unique to India. I mean, it's there in all modern democracies to varying extents, and especially in countries with a lot of inequality. But I think it's pushed to an extreme in India because of the extreme nature of the inequalities. Not only the economic inequalities, which are as high as in China, Brazil, or any other of the highly unequal developing societies in the world, but also because of further social inequalities, particularly of caste and of gender, which tend to reinforce the inequalities and create an extremely divided and hierarchical society, where those who are at the bottom of these multiple layers of inequalities are extremely disempowered and barely participating in this democracy, which on the one hand is a very remarkable democracy. We have to recognize that, especially in a backward country like Belgium, where women got the right to vote only after Indian women. There are many remarkable aspects to Indian democracy, whether it's the electoral system, which works pretty well in spite of covering 1 billion people and sometimes very difficult conflictual situations, remote terrain and so on. And yet the elections are pretty well organized, and the turnout rates are very high in spite of voting not being compulsory. It goes up to basically between 60 and 70%, which is very high in international perspective. And of course, almost double what you find in the US, which is about 30%. And then a great pluralism that we find in very few countries in the world, with more political parties being represented in parliament than I think anywhere else, you know, from far right to far left. And as I said, great freedom of expression. So there are all these positive aspects of Indian democracy, and at the same time a fundamental issue that a lot of people are not really part of it. I mean, they do vote every 5 years, but with very limited information about the different parties and what they represent, and limited understanding, limited voice. And obviously, this act of voting every 5 years is not a very powerful form of participation in democratic life, and it's not really adequate to ensure that their interests and demands and rights are adequately represented. And then on the other hand, there are people who are educated and well off and organized, and who can make very active use of these democratic institutions and have their voice heard. So the result of this, or one result of this, is a kind of pervasive neglect of the basic needs of people in public policy, economic policy, social policy, fiscal policy, even trade policy. You find it at all levels if you look at it. For example, in the case of fiscal policy, it takes the form of huge concessions for privileged classes, huge power subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, electricity subsidies, and on the other hand, remarkably little being spent and being done for underprivileged people who really desperately need some kind of social support. It's also reflected, obviously, in social policy, with still a very limited social sector. If you add up public expenditure on education, health, and social security, it's about, let's say, 3 to 4% for education. In fact, now it's closer to 3% than 4%. And 1% for health, which is one of the lowest ratios in the world. There are very few countries in the world, except maybe Afghanistan and Sierra Leone and Congo, or one or two others. Very few countries that spend less than 1% of GDP on education, public expenditure on education. So 3% plus 1% for health, and maybe 1% for social security, including food security and so on and so forth. So you're talking of something like 5 or 6% of GDP, which is really very low in international perspective, compared to maybe 35% in OECD countries. Of course, the OECD countries are much richer, so nobody is saying that you can make that jump in, instantly. But if India looks to the future, I think it has to look at a very big expansion of these forms of public action. It was particularly important for India to make an early investment in education. I think this is something that now we realize more and more. If there's one thing we have learned in development economics in the last 20 years, it is the importance of education, whether it is the importance for economic growth, whether it is for demographic change, for health, for social equality, for democracy. For all these things and many more, education is absolutely crucial. And that fundamental importance of education in development was really missed for a very long time in India. And now there's a certain amount of catching up and greater attention being given to education. There's a Right to Education Act that was passed in 2010. But we're still paying the price of these decades of neglect. I lived in a village in Uttar Pradesh in the early 80s, and I remember how in that village with about 1,200 people, and therefore maybe 200 or 300 children who should have been all in school. The school was just one person, and he was the son of the headman of the village, sitting under a tree when he felt like. And some kids would come, and to the extent that he felt like he would teach them. It was really absolutely catastrophic. And the funny thing is that there was no protest, and he was the son of the headman of the village. So you might have thought that this would create some kind of accountability on his part. But in fact, it was the exact reverse. It was creating a protection for him to continue. So there was a long period when education was completely out of focus among the priorities of public policy. And education, of course, is always important, but was perhaps all the more important for India because it was a chance, if there had been from the beginning an effort to create a system of universal and equitable and quality education, it could have played a role in creating a semblance of equality of opportunity and overcoming this heritage of huge historical inequalities that have been a burden in so many respects. But in fact, what has happened is that the education system has become part of the system of social inequalities and tends to reproduce the inequalities instead of overcoming them. So that certainly has been a big issue. One can say similar things about health. As I mentioned, it's been, the public health expenditure is extremely low, and the whole health system is extremely inefficient, inequitable, exploitative, and it was a discovery for me while writing on this book to find out to what extent, how bad the health system was, and how far behind India had fallen in some really critical respects. For example, immunization of children. I didn't realize that the child immunization levels in India are among the worst in the world. It's more or less at par with sub-Saharan Africa, which is pretty shocking, and it's way behind Bangladesh and even now behind Nepal. Similarly, things like sanitation, there's a huge blind spot there. I mean, half of the households in India have to defecate in the open because they have no sanitation facilities of any kind. And we are discovering now that it's a huge health hazard. I mean, it's also, of course, a huge hardship in itself, especially for women and for old people who are not very mobile, for women who have to rise before dawn to go to the field and then have no chance to relieve themselves after that for the whole day. So it's both a huge hardship, but of course for people who don't matter very much, for poor people, for women, for old people. And then on top of that, a huge health hazard. And again, in this respect, India has fallen behind very badly. I mean, it's the 50% of households having to practice open defecation is again among the worst figures you can find in the world. The corresponding figure in Bangladesh is 10%, and China is 1%. So, and the point is that not only it's such a big problem, but it's been completely out of focus. In fact, there's an interesting person called Jean Drèze in India, who is now Minister of Rural Development, and in fact is one of the few people who have tried to make this a bit of an issue. And in a recent speech, he said, whenever we talk about sanitation in India, we hear only giggles, because it's basically not an issue. Of course, all these things are changing, but I'll come back to that a little bit. And then the whole field of social security, anti-poverty programs, pensions, food security, basically providing some kind of economic security for poor households. Again, there are huge deficiencies. Now, all this, of course, varies a great deal between different parts of India. As you know, there's a huge diversity in India, and in particular, a big contrast between different states. And some states, like Kerala, of course, is the best-known example, have a long history of more active social policies, of social reform, political empowerment of disadvantaged groups, and especially early investment in education. I mean, if there's one thing that can help to understand Kerala's experience, is this huge investment in education that goes back further than independence, and has given Kerala much higher levels of education than any other state until recently. And then later on, Kerala was able to build on that and benefit in so many ways from this investment in human resources. And interestingly now, it's not only Kerala. There are some other states that have been following somewhat on the footsteps of Kerala, and with similar results. One interesting case is Tamil Nadu, where there was also a huge investment. First of all, a history of social reforms going before independence, women's liberation starting already on that time, Dalits getting organized, people basically learning to have a voice in public life and public policy. And then immediately after independence, a huge investment in elementary education, and later on in other kinds of public services like health, social security, midday meals. Tamil Nadu was the first state to introduce midday meals in primary schools and became a model for the country in that respect. A pretty good healthcare system, certainly compared to other states. And over time, similar results as Kerala. In fact, Tamil Nadu's social indicators now are catching up pretty rapidly with those of Kerala, whether it's health indicators, life expectancy, literacy, nutrition, and so on and so forth. And then more recently, Himachal Pradesh in the north of India, which became an independent state in the early 1970s, and again made a big investment in education immediately after that, and had a bit of a heritage of greater social equality, at least compared to other regions of India. So again, following similar route, has achieved also very impressive results. In fact, caught up with Kerala within 20 or 30 years in the field of elementary education, which is a really remarkable achievement, based on public initiative, government schools, and a huge political commitment to elementary education that has been so much lacking in the rest of India. What is interesting today, I think, is that we are beginning to see similar things happening also in other states, slowly but surely. I mean, it's of course still there's a big gap between, let's say, Kerala and Tamil Nadu and other states on the one hand and other states on the other. But we are beginning to see other states taking a little more interest in issues of social development and taking initiatives in fields like health, education, social security. And the pattern is that when a real effort is made to make these things function better, and when the financial resources are made available, and when there's some application of mind, and most importantly, a political backing for these initiatives, almost invariably there are positive results. I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I have in mind. One of the most interesting recent initiatives was the national program of midday meals in primary schools, which took inspiration from Tamil Nadu. It started in Tamil Nadu, then Kerala, then a few other states introduced midday meals mainly in the tribal areas like Orissa and Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh. And then in 2001, there was an order of the Supreme Court saying that we have to introduce cooked midday meals in all primary schools. Initially, there was quite a bit of resistance. People said, can we afford this? Teachers were not always very enthusiastic. The high-caste parents sometimes didn't like their children to eat the same food as low-caste children. And of course, the quality initially was very rudimentary. It was just rice and salt, or maybe rice and turmeric or something. And then over time, because there was such a strong public demand, and, people were really keen on this, and then there was also an effort to mobilize the media, and then of course there was a vigilance of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court commissioners were appointed to monitor the implementation of these orders. So over time, we've seen quite a lot of improvements, and even states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh that were thought incapable of being able to manage this kind of social programs actually did a reasonably good job. So today, this is actually one of the best programs of the Indian government, and if you go almost anywhere in India, even the most remote and poorest and inaccessible village, you will see a midday meal in place. The quality is still far from what it should be, but still we are seeing fairly steady improvement. The menus have improved. Many states now are giving eggs to children, which is very good for growing children because they don't get animal proteins at home, and this is something that can compensate for that.
And this is for free, the state?
This is free. This is paid for by the government. In Tamil Nadu now they give one egg every day to every child at school. In Orissa and Chhattisgarh they've started giving 2 eggs a week. In Jharkhand now it's 1 egg a week. So what I'm saying is over time, gradually, we are seeing other states being able to catch up with programs that were initiated by the more visionary states and that were thought to be very difficult to replicate. When 20 years ago when we talked about Kerala, people said, yes, of course, but Kerala had, so many things. It had missionary activity, it had matrilini, it had Communist Party and this and that and so on. And we can't do the same thing elsewhere in India. And now I'm actually more and more convinced that actually there's nothing special about Malayalis or Tamils. It's just that they are ahead. I mean, they have made an early start on a route that actually can be followed to a large extent by other states as well. Another interesting example is the reform of the public distribution system. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically there's something in India called the public distribution system, which basically means that every village has a ration shop, and people who have a ration card are supposed to be entitled to subsidized food commodities, mainly cereals, mainly rice and wheat, through these ration shops. That system, again, started working pretty well in a few states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Himachal Pradesh, to some extent other southern states like Andhra Pradesh, but for a very long time it worked very badly in most of the states of India, and in fact in the northern states, including Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, it was, there was a huge amount of corruption, and this is something that most people thought will never be able to improve. In fact, one of my friends, Harsh Mandar, who used to be in the Indian Administrative Service and who served as a district collector in Madhya Pradesh for a long time, told me he was telling us as recently as 2005 that it is one thing that will never be able to improve in Chhattisgarh. Yes, it is the public distribution system, because he said, I have tried it. I have tried in my district. We've tried everything. And the vested interests are so strong, and the corruption, the nexus of corruption is so strong that we just cannot defeat it. Within 2 years of that, the government of Chhattisgarh, which had one of the most corrupt public distribution systems, decided for political reasons, not out of charity, for basically with a view to making electoral gains, decided to try to fix the public distribution system. And then the first thing they did is they took on the private dealers who were running these ration shops and making money from it, from the system. And they tried to deprivatize the ration shops. So the idea is that if people run their own ration shops, why would you cheat? Because it would be like cheating yourself. So there was an effort to give the management of ration shops to community institutions, or at least institutions that were closer and more accountable to the community, like the village councils, cooperatives, women's self-help groups, and so on, and get rid of the private dealers who were responsible for this corruption. The dealers went to court and claimed that they had a right to run these ration shops. That went on for a couple of years, and finally they lost, so the court said that no, it's perfectly legitimate for the state government to deprivatize these ration shops. So the ration shops were deprivatized. The base of the system was expanded by including more people to create more pressure on the system to work. So about 80% of the rural population in Chhattisgarh was brought into the public distribution system. The issue price was reduced so that people have a strong stake in the system, because if the higher the subsidy you get, the more interest you will have in ensuring that the system works. And then a series of transparency measures were put in place. The system was computerized. A lot of people were caught and sent to jail. And within a couple of years, this led to a remarkable turnaround in the system. I mean, there are many studies now, and I've also been there many times, and everywhere you go in Chhattisgarh, except possibly in some of the conflict-ridden southern districts where there's a general problem of non-functional administration. In the rest of the state, basically you find that now the system works almost like clockwork. Most people have a ration card and are entitled to 35 kilos of rice per month at a nominal price. It's like 1 rupee a kilo, so it's as good as free. Now 35 kilos of rice is not the end of poverty, but for people who live on the margin of subsistence and who've been exposed to hunger for centuries, it really makes a big difference. I mean, and of course the other thing is that because of this or other reasons, the government came back to power, and that inspired other states after that to make the same kind of decision of, instead of participating in the system of corruption, why don't we try to make that system work and make some electoral gains from it. So now there's a trend in many states of serious reform and improvement of the public distribution system. And the National Food Security Act that was passed a few months ago in September is an opportunity to extend these gains across the country and try to put the entire system on a new footing and ensures that it actually works. So these are examples of things that were thought very difficult to do. One can give other examples in the field of education, in the field of health, in the field of nutrition, and so on, showing that states that were not capable of having active and constructive social policies actually can do quite a lot. But all these successes have been outcomes of democratic politics. It's never, it's not like a government, it's not like an advisor comes around and says, okay, hey, why don't we do this? And then the government says, oh, great idea, let's do it. It basically takes mobilization, it takes electoral competition, it takes public debate. Basically, it takes mobilizing all the resources of this democratic system to try to change the priorities of public policy and also the social norms. It's not the public policy, it's also the work culture and the social norms. I'll end with a few words on a particular range of efforts that have been trying to accelerate this trend towards more active and constructive and effective social policies in India, which is the effort to put in place legislations to protect economic and social rights. If you're familiar with the Indian Constitution, there are two types of rights in the Indian Constitution. Some of them are called fundamental rights, like the right to free expression and the right to life, which are fundamental rights that cannot be denied under any circumstances and that can be enforced in court. So you can go, if your right to freedom of expression is denied, you can go to the Supreme Court. In fact, the Constitution gives you a right to take it up in the Supreme Court itself to defend these fundamental rights. And then there are economic and social rights that are in what is called the directive principles of the Constitution, including, at that time, the right to education, although that is now a fundamental right. But in the beginning, it was a directive principle, right to social security, right to work, and so on. And these rights are not enforceable in court. In fact, it's explicitly said in Article 37 of the Constitution that these rights will not be enforceable in any court. But the same article also goes on to specify that nevertheless they are fundamental to the governance of the country, and they will be taken into account in making laws. So there was a vision at that time of making laws that would give expression to the extent possible to these economic and social rights. But that perspective fell into oblivion for a very long time, and now there's an effort to revive it and put in place laws that give actually legally enforceable entitlements to things like education, health, social security, and so on and so forth. The first big breakthrough in this respect was the Right to Information Act in 2005, which gives a very extensive right to information. Basically, anybody can ask for virtually any information, short of military secrets or something. There are virtually no exemptions, and anyone can apply. You don't have to justify, you don't have to explain why you are applying for the information. You don't have to prove that you're a citizen, you don't have to give your address, you don't even have to make a written application, you don't have to fill a form, you can just make a demand on plain paper, and if you can't write, you can even make an oral demand. So it's basically it's designed to make it as easy as possible for people to apply. And then the information has to be supplied. And information is defined also in a very broad way. It's not just documents. Documents is one form of information, but it can be you can ask any questions, you can ask for samples of material if there's a construction site or something. The information has to be provided within 30 days, or otherwise the concerned functionaries can be fined, in fact have to be fined. And every public authority across the country, from top to bottom has to have what is called the Public Information Officer, whose job it is to receive these applications, help people to apply, and provide the information. Furthermore, there's also a duty of what is called proactive disclosure, that without waiting for anyone to apply, every public authority has to place all the essential information that concerns its activities in the public domain. So it's a very strong legislation, and it's the beauty of it is that it's very democratic, because it gives a right to everybody that millions of people literally have been using ever since in all kinds of contexts. So every year there are about 1 million applications for information, and most of them are successful in the sense that the relevant information is provided. That has been, of course, very important also to curb corruption, because corruption thrives on secrecy. By definition, corruption is something that is hidden since it's illegal. And this putting of information in the public domain, and this building also of a culture of transparency, because now, even if you don't invoke that law, you can get information because the functionaries have accepted that public administration now is basically in the public domain. So there's no point resisting if somebody asks for information now, more or less systematically, it's given. So it's not just a legal right, it's also changing the culture of public administration, and a great step towards greater transparency and accountability. So that was one. There's also a Right to Education Act, which strictly speaking is actually more like a Right to Education Facilities Act than a Right to Education Act. It's not the same thing, but basically it defines some minimum standards that all the schools have to meet, and of course it also says that there has to be a government school within 1 kilometer of every habitation. And there has been, partly as a result of this law, a very major improvement in the education infrastructure in India in the last few years, and also in school participation, because there's better infrastructure, there are midday meals, and also many other incentives like scholarships, textbooks, bicycles for girls, and so on and so forth. I should mention that a lot of this has been made possible by rapid economic growth. I mean, the Indian economy has become the second fastest large economy in the world in the last 20 years. And one consequence of that is that the public resources have increased quite rapidly. So the public revenue available for all these programs, the total public revenue is about 4 times as high today as it was 20 years ago. So there are a lot of, and every year there are more resources being made available. So things like midday meals, scholarships, textbooks, and so on are much more affordable today than they were earlier. And correspondingly, there's been a much faster increase in school participation than most people would have thought possible 10 years ago. I don't think that 10 years ago many people would have expected that India would be as close to universal elementary education as it is today. Of course, the quality of education remains really poor. I mean, that's a big issue, but one can think of that as the next step in the consolidation of economic policy, that now that the infrastructure is largely in place, we should concentrate more on issues of quality and pupil achievements. And again, hopefully, the pattern that I mentioned earlier, that when you try to address these problems, and you put the resources and the political commitment behind it, things change. I think that can also apply to the quality of education. There's another law called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which perhaps you have heard about, which came into force in 2005. And the basic principle is that any adult who lives in rural areas can apply for employment on local public works. And if you demand work, you have to be employed within 15 days. Otherwise, you're entitled to an unemployment allowance. That's the theory. And of course, there are other entitlements also, like payment of minimum wage, employment within 5 kilometers, basic worksite facilities like drinking water, shade, first aid, even creches in theory, and payment of wages within 15 days. So there's a range of entitlements. All this, of course, is your legal right, but it doesn't happen automatically. The right to information is a little easier because it's a much simpler principle and it's much easier to enforce. The Employment Guarantee Act is quite a complex program. And also it's something that has met with much more opposition. The Right to Information Act is virtually no opposition. And the corporate sector in particular is very supportive because it gives them more power vis-a-vis the state. But the Employment Guarantee Act, there's a lot of opposition from employers, from the corporate sector, from big farmers, sometimes from functionaries who feel that it's too much work and so on and so forth. So it has been a real struggle, and it is still a struggle today, to ensure that these entitlements are actually realized. And they are only being realized very partially. But nevertheless, immediately after this law came into force, there was a huge expansion of public works. About 50 million people are working on this program every year. Not permanently, of course, but on average they may be getting 40 or 50 days of employment per year at the minimum wage, which is not, again, not the end of poverty, but it's an important form of income support for people who have no alternative. And a lot of productive assets have been generated. It's not always very productive. There are many criticisms that the quality of work is often below standard, and I have seen many examples of works that were really poor and, if not unproductive. But there are also many examples of very useful things that have been done, whether it's water conservation works, rural roads, wells, afforestation. There's actually quite a lot of potential for reasonably productive, labor-intensive public works. And finally, just a couple of months ago, as I said, the National Food Security Act has also come into force, again based on the same principle that we need legal guarantees for social and economic rights. And briefly, the Food Security Act has three major entitlements. One is the midday meals in schools, which were already there in a sense, because, as I said, there are Supreme Court orders protecting these programs. So they were already de facto legal entitlements, but this is now a permanent legal entitlement. And there are similar provisions now also for children of preschool age, those below the age of 6 years. So it's not just in school now, it's also the children below the age of 6 years who are supposed to get nutrition support through what is called Anganwadis, which is basically childcare centers. Second entitlement is the maternity entitlement, so income support in cash for all pregnant women. Not very generous, it's about 1,000 rupees a month for 6 months, which is like, roughly speaking, the salary of 1 week of work as a casual laborer. So it's like a week's income for a casual laborer every month for 6 months. It's not a big deal, but what is important is the principle that every pregnant woman is entitled to some support, because first of all, it's important for her own well-being, and secondly, the malnutrition of children starts from that time, the time of pregnancy and childbirth and so on. So from the point of view of child nutrition is also very important. And then the third set of entitlements is about the public distribution system. And roughly speaking, this covers about 2/3 of the population, 75% in rural areas and 50% in urban areas. And every family covered by every eligible family is entitled to 25 kilos of wheat or rice at a nominal price every month. So that's basically consolidating what I spoke about earlier, which is the reform and expansion of the public distribution system. So to recapitulate, the way I see it is that there's a real debate and even a battle today in India about the social role of the state. I mean, there's a growing public demand for functioning public services, for good schools, for health centers, for nutrition support, for pensions also, which I didn't talk about, but again, there are efforts of the same kind of making pensions universal and legally enforceable, for employment guarantee and so on. And despite all the defects of Indian democracy, there is an obligation ultimately for state governments and the central government to respond to these demands. And on the other hand, there's also quite a bit of opposition to all this, in particular from the corporate sector, which has become very powerful in India and has a big influence on public policy, and tends to be very suspicious and in fact quite hostile to a lot of this. Based on a rather short-sighted perspective, I mean, actually, if you take an enlightened view, I feel that investments in health, education, and social security is something that benefits not only the recipients, but actually the country as a whole. So there are some relatively enlightened people, even in the corporate sector, who support, I mean, certainly education and health, for example. But the general attitude is that, you know, we don't want to pay taxes for supporting poor people. It's not put that way. It's not that people will put it in so many words. But they will say that, you know, we shouldn't make people we shouldn't transform people into beggars, and we shouldn't reduce work incentives, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a steady stream of arguments against these initiatives. And I think the future of India depends quite a lot on the outcome of this tussle about the role of the state, the social role of the state in particular. And we are trying to contribute to a positive outcome, but nothing is guaranteed.